Hey, I think it looks like we're live.
Hey, we are live calling
Mhm.
Chris Anderson, and you look like you're in a familiar spot.
I am. I'm still in Windsor, which is kind of unusual. And you are still in Chicago.
Still in Chicago. I know we were just talking to Cheryl. She was talking about how cold it was in New Orleans, and we're about the same temperature, and it feels really warm here.
Hey, okay.
So welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, and thanks to Stephen Ambrose Tours for their assistance in bringing you the show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or maybe you're listening in your car to the HHH
podcast.
Welcome. And today we'll be talking about Jackie Robinson and Paul Robeson. I think a very interesting show that you'll enjoy. And Chris, I should mention our Patreon supporters, shouldn't I?
Absolutely, you should.
Yeah, so we want to thank all of our Patreon supporters, especially our top shelf supporters. And we did get an email from Jane Byers today asking about, she was having some trouble navigating in to become a top shelf patron. So we'll get tech support on that and try to help her become a top shelf patron. And
and thank you for reaching out to us.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. All she has to do is give me her credit card number, all her information. I'll take care of it for you. Don't ever look at a bill again. You should be fine. Okay. So, Chris, do we have anybody out there watching?
Absolutely. Yeah, Cheryl has joined us from snowy North Carolina. Doreen, Ted Moon from Virginia, and Ken from Kansas. Gwen Simmons from Frederick, Maryland. And Nancy Nylance is back. Hello, Nancy. Good to have you back again. And so Houston is in the house.
All right. And I'm going to see Doreen in May when I'm down in Tennessee to talk about the Ghost Army. So, yeah, looking forward to that. So we ready to rock and roll here?
I think so.
All right. Well, give me a cue and I'll get us started. Can you hear it?
I can. That was a good, very good. The bar is open. It was like in stereo. It was like 2 clicks.
The bar is open. Hey, Jackie Robinson and Paul Robeson were two trailblazing African Americans whose lives intersected before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And we will dive into this story with Howard Bryant, who is the author of a new book called Kings and Pawns, Jackie Robinson and Paul Robeson in America. And Howard is a senior writer for ESPN.com. He's also served as the sports correspondent for NPR's Weekend Edition Saturday since 2006. Happy 20th anniversary. He's the author of 3 previous books: Shut Out, a story of race and baseball in Boston; Juicing the Game, Drugs, Power, and the Fight for the Soul of Major League Baseball; and The Last Hero, A Life of Henry Aaron. And perhaps most important of all, Howard is another Boston guy.
So it's like a trifecta.
Are we all from Boston?
Well,
from Boston.
Chris is born in Boston. I'm from Rhode Island, but I lived in Boston for 33 years, and you're from Dorchester. So
goodness gracious. And we spent a lot of time at Rocky Point when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Little Rhode Island, what was that, in Warwick?
All right. On the other side of the bay from me, because I was in East Providence. So, but did you bring
you and Davy Lopes?
Yeah, we were like this. I don't know. Hey, Howard, did you bring a drink?
I did bring a drink. I brought a frosty mug of Peroni here because
nice.
I love my Italian beer.
Fantastic. Chris, how about you?
A Falkirk single malt.
Okay, and I've got a Hopwell IPA. So cheers to us.
Cheers to us.
Yeah. So, Howard, you've written a book about 2 very prominent African Americans: Paul Robeson, who was a leading figure of the 30s and 40s; Jackie Robinson, probably most famous for what he did in the 40s and 50s. And I was interested about 3/4 of the way through the book to realize that these are 2 people who never met face to face. So why have you paired them and focused on them in this book?
Yeah, that was the surprise. And one, thank you for having me on. It is a pleasure to talk about this subject. Obviously, it's something I've been working on for several years. Yeah, well, I think one of the things that was interesting to me about this project was that Paul Robeson is one of the greatest, most talented Americans of the 20th century in terms of his. When we talk about Jackie Robinson integrating Major League Baseball, April 15th, 1947, Paul Robeson integrated Broadway with Othello, 1943, October. Previously, all of the American productions of Shakespeare's Jealous Moor had been with white actors in blackface until Robeson came along. And this man was just such an incredible figure. One of the greatest college football players of all time, one of the, a lawyer, one of the great actors, great concert singer, opera singer, stage actor. There's just so much. And what brought these two together was the Cold War, was the politics of the time, the dissolution of the tenuous Soviet alliance with the United States during World War II. And then immediately following, of course, we get into this period of the Cold War and the casualties of that. And Robeson obviously was one of them in terms of by the time we get to 1947, 46, 47, this country is in the middle of retrenchment. It's in the middle of loyalty oaths, in the middle of creating these subversive lists from the Attorney General. And so much of the country is shifting. And where was what was going to happen to all of those folks who were of very left-wing liberal politics, and how would they adjust to the coming tide?
So, getting back to Robeson, and I think that as I was reading the book, I guess that one of the things that came out, and I guess that's sort of the point of the book, is I knew the name, but I just had no idea about what a giant this person was, and I guess part of the reason I don't is what happens to him. You have a quote towards the end of the book, and you say his name, so Robeson, would still survive the way important names do, faintly, regally, hovering mysteriously with importance, but we would be devoid of the most critical, unrecoverable element, knowledge of who he was, what he had been and stood for, and how his country had treated him. Robeson's name would loom vaguely, guiltily in death over America and Black America in particular. So can you tell us, let people know just what a giant he was before we kind of get into this?
Well, of course. I think that the first part of the first half of the 20th century, I think, and my argument is he's the most famous Black man in the world. We like to, in sports, we love to talk about our world championships and our World Series, but those are pretty much domestic North American endeavors. No, Robeson was a giant in China, in the Soviet Union, in Europe, in Australia, everywhere, because of his artistic talent, because of his musical talent, obviously. And you're dealing with somebody who was also, in addition to those things, incredibly active in Africa, very active in terms of the anti-colonial movements. And he and the great Black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois had been taking an interest in Pan-African conferences since the 1920s. So one of the things in the book that I really wanted to focus on, of course, was this idea, this conflict, this idea of Pan-Africanism, the United States, African Americans connected to the African struggle around the globe, and how someone with Robeson's name, as famous as he was, how much he could affect, and how influential he was, and whether or not, and how we would respond to that here. I always found it fascinating when you think about somebody of that size. The question for me had been, I think, to Chris's point, how do we not know who he is? That's how does someone who is that well known at the time, how do they fall into history? One of my great mentors, I consider him a great mentor. I love all of his work. David Marinus has always said, history writes people out of the story, and it's our job to write them back in. And so there was a clear split. And that split was, once again, it was the Cold War. And to really sort of put a point on this, for my generation, I'm a Cold War child, like most of us. If you're if you're a Gen Xer and a Boomer, if you're in that category, you're Cold War. You're created by the Cold War. But for me, the Cold War was international. The Cold War was the Olympics. It was the USA and Russia and the day after and the missile gap and all of that. It wasn't this period. This period was domestic subversion, that there is an element in this country. And you can hear a lot of that rhetoric today, the enemy within, the enemy of the people who are, people aren't what they seem, where it's neighbor versus neighbor, and questioning the patriotism and the Americanism of your fellow citizens. That's the area where Robeson really saw his demise. And that's one of the reasons why so few people know specifically of him and who he was today.
So he to kind of follow up on that, he is, I guess the simple question would be to say, why does this happen? I mean, Paul Robeson is essentially canceled, right, in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So why does this happen? And part of this has to do with that he is a big supporter of the Soviet Union and of Stalin, and never backs down from that, as far as I could tell, reading your book. But at the same time, you suggest, I think it's fair to say, that in some cases, anti-communism is really a cover for racism. And so I'm trying to kind of get to the whole bottom of this. What happens? What happens that makes Paul Robeson essentially disappear, eventually get his passport canceled, eventually not be able to perform concerts anywhere, eventually draw
Jackie Robinson against him?
Yeah.
Well, I think that the tide against him is the tide of the country. I mean, I think that's, and I think when you're working on a book like this or any project, I don't know if you guys are as neurotic as I am when it comes to trying to complete projects, but
I think we are very neurotic. Flame neuroses all over. Yeah.
But the number one question is how does what's going to make this book fail? What can where am I going to run to disaster? What has to happen?
Okay.
Well, one of the things
it's the opposite of the question I usually ask, but go ahead.
Well, in other words, what has to be there? What do you have to get? And to me, one of the things you had to get was you had to be able to convey that in the 1940s, the word communist was the most disqualifying word in the English language in the United States. That if you were accused of this, you were a traitor. True cancellation, that you had to, if you wanted to work for the federal government in 1947, you had to sign a loyalty oath. That you had, I mean, this wasn't, Coke versus Pepsi. If you were on the side of the Soviet Union, if you didn't denounce the Soviet Union, not stay silent on it, but if you really didn't denounce the Soviet Union as the enemy of the United States, you were putting your entire career, your livelihood in danger. And I'm not just talking about being famous. I'm talking about if you were a plumber, or if you were a janitor, or if you were an accountant. I mean, people were losing their careers. Look at the Hollywood 10. I mean, the country was going after people it considered to be subversive. And a lot of the politics then you see somewhat now, and I saw a lot of the similarities in terms of, the attack on, I don't think I would say that communism was a cover for racism. I would say that what I really found was communism as more of a cover against the New Deal. I think that's really where I started to see a lot of the real right-wing politics affecting, these different groups of the political factions. Where the racism piece came in was where Robeson was also, in addition to not disavowing the Soviet Union, also producing a very, very strong critique of the United States and of the Black experience coming out of World War II, where today, post 9/11, we talk greatly about thank you for your service and about giving the veterans the dignity of fighting for this country and really producing for them a welcome for what they've done. But if you were a Black man wearing a uniform coming out of World War II, you were a target. The violence, if you look at that period, that violence is extreme. And the combination of Robeson, one, associating with the Soviet Union, and two, really attacking American racism made him a very unpopular target. And I think one of the things that we don't talk about, why I think this period is such a very interesting period, is that level of animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union really did push the civil rights movement back 10 years. They pushed it out to about 1955 instead of 1945, because if you were really going to fight for your rights coming out of World War II, then you were labeled as un-American.
So, and in this environment, Robeson and Robinson are kind of, I guess, in the book, sort of two ends of the spectrum. And another quote, because I think it's important. You quote W.B. Du Bois, who's another great African American hero and fighter for civil rights and et cetera. But he says, speaking about being an American, he says, one feels his own two-ness.
Yeah.
An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, and one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Can you kind of explain that quote a little bit and how that fits into the story?
Well, yeah, and that is the question. I mean, I think that, is it possible to be an American and a dissenter at the same time? Is it possible to be asked to do, as Paul Robeson had been asked to do, which was to be the symbol of all that was possible in a segregated society, while at the same time knowing full well that the minute you asked for your rights or demanded your rights or talked about unequal treatment, you were going to, you were a second-class citizen. Was it possible to be both? That two-ness. Du Bois used to talk about it as double consciousness, to be Black and to also be American at the same time. Can this balance exist? And that's where Jackie Robinson really comes in, because here's Robinson at the same time. At one point, Robeson is the guy that everyone is looking toward. He was called America's #1 Negro. And the great Ed Sullivan, before moving on to television fame, was a columnist at the New York Daily News. And he had written about Robeson during the Othello period, being the person who really represented this new opportunity for this country to come together. And so there's your balance. And so I think what was really interesting was for each of these characters to be positioned after Robeson. Now you have Jackie coming in. He integrates baseball. This is the great American sport. And now he is the one who is elevated as the symbol of what is possible in the segregated society. And that is the reason why, as you asked earlier, it took a long way around to get to it, but that is the reason why these two were sort of placed in opposition to each other. Robinson he has taken the Robeson role, and now the country is asking him to step forward and talk about, to really represent American values against someone who they are now considering to be subversive.
So one of the pivot points of your book is Robinson's 1949 testimony in front of the House Un-American Affairs Committee. I called it the Un-American Activities Committee before, so it's all un-American things. And we'll get to that. But I found it fascinating that Robeson is invited to speak to baseball executives in 1943. Including Branch Rickey, who's the new president of the Dodgers then. And he's there at a meeting with baseball executives and Black newspaper editors. And this is 4 years before Robinson will integrate baseball as the first African-American player. So what's going on at this meeting? Because I just thought it was like, whoa, this is amazing.
Yeah, it was fascinating to me because I had known about this, and I had known a little bit about it. I had known that Robeson spoke to the baseball owners in 1943, and I didn't know the context of it. I'd known that it had happened, but what I didn't know was that the Major League Baseball, the commissioner's office, has the minutes of that meeting, and those minutes had essentially been sitting in a warehouse for 80 years. And in 2017, baseball donated them to the Hall of Fame. So finally, for the first time, you could read the transcript and find out what happened at that meeting. And that's one of the interesting things about the project, is that the title is that sort of double entendre, triple entendre of who's being manipulated by whom and at what time in history. So I had always gone into the 1943 meeting thinking that Robeson had walked into the baseball owners, to get them to integrate or to convince them, especially during the war, that this is a great step. And that is true, except for the fact of the Double V campaign. The Double V campaign is the campaign by the Black press, Double V, victory abroad, victory at home, which was a counter to the approach of the First World War, where African Americans and the Black leadership said, okay, we're going to suppress our quest for rights in exchange for supporting the war effort. In World War II, the Black press was like, no, we're going to do both. We're going to fight at home, and we're also going to fight abroad. And so in doing that, the Black press campaigned a great number of American institutions to open their doors to Black people, to integrate. And they had planned in December at the winter meetings in 1943 to boycott baseball, to essentially go out and picket baseball, to say, listen, we are dying abroad for this country. We can't play second base. We can't play. And so in responding to this threat, it was the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who's the hottest guy in town in 1943, but Paul Robeson. So he essentially invites Robeson to address the baseball owners, to essentially attest to their goodness. So in a lot of ways, Robeson is the first one who's essentially being manipulated. And in that when that meeting is done, where Robeson addresses addresses the owners, and then the Black press also addresses the owners. When the meeting's about to adjourn, one voice, and all these the famous baseball names, Yawkey and O'Malley and Wrigley and all of these great names that we know in baseball, they're ready to adjourn the meeting. And one voice says, hey, are we going to address the fact that this delegation came to speak to us? Are we going to have any conversation about this? And the answer was no, because it was simply a flanking move to tamp down protest against them. But the person in that room was Branch Rickey, and Branch Rickey showed multiple times in that meeting that he was not willing to adjourn that meeting without some conversation. And that is the first time where you find out Rickey's about to do something, that he's up to something. Before that, you had no idea that this was what he was going to do. So those minutes were really fascinating because, one, nobody else in the owners in the meeting stood up and said anything except, can we go home now? Can we go have lunch? But Rickey was the one who kept pressing the point. And then obviously you find out what happens later, that, within 2 years, Rickey has signed Jackie Robinson. That is, when you think about those pivot points, that was the first moment when you knew history was about to change.
So tell us a little bit more about Rickey. I mean, is he a great social justice campaigner, or
is it a little more mixed?
Yeah,
it's a lot more mixed. What I love about these types of stories in history is, one, nobody's version of baseball integration had gone more unchallenged until this book than Branch Rickey's. Branch Rickey's version of history has been the history. He had told the story of his moral disgust at one of his players back in the early 1900s. Charlie Thomas was not allowed to travel or stay with the team when he was coach at Wesleyan. And so he let this poor catcher, Charlie Thomas, stay in his room. And when he got to his room, Charlie was sitting on his cot crying, trying to scratch his own skin off because his blackness was what was holding him back. And if only he didn't have that, he could actually live a dignified life. And this was the fulcrum for Rickey. This was the motivation for Rickey to do what he did. That's partially true. That's not really true. What is really true is that in Brooklyn, the Jewish community and especially the new transplants from Eastern Europe were very labor-based. There was an extremely fertile political movement taking place, especially in Brooklyn, and not New York, Brooklyn specifically, pressing baseball to integrate. It's a long time ago, obviously, but the Yankees played up in the Bronx. They weren't getting the same pressure to integrate that the Dodgers were. The Giants played in Harlem. They weren't getting the same pressure, but the Dodgers were. The Dodgers Brooklyn had elected far left, progressive, communist members to city council. And so Brooklyn was really pressuring Branch Rickey to do something, and he could feel that. And certainly part of his motivation to take advantage of the integration movement was also to, again, he was dealing with protest. He was dealing with an extremely volatile constituency who said, listen, if integration is going to take place, it needs to take place here. And I think Rickey also as a person, obviously, whenever you read about Branch Rickey, you hear about his anti-communism. All of that is true. Rickey was an anti-New Dealer, very anti-Roosevelt guy. And so the tide was turning, both in terms of New York politics with the Ives-Quinn Act, the FEPC in terms of Fair Employment Practices Committee in Washington. Integration is coming. We're coming out, World War II is coming to an end. It's coming. And the question was going to be, just like we would see later during the Civil Rights Movement, what's it going to be? Are you going to be Atlanta, where Atlanta says, okay, we're going to be the city too busy to hate? Or are you going to be Birmingham, where Birmingham says, no, we are going to retrench? So Rickey realized that the tide was coming. He realized it before anybody else in baseball. He was willing to do something about it. And that is sort of the battle inside of the battle. And that's why, he's, Chris, to your point, extremely complicated figure. Certainly not the hero of the baseball story that he's been given credit for the damn near a century. However, he's also the guy who did it. He's the guy who went up against the tide and against the baseball owners, and he made it happen. So a lot of response that I've gotten in this book is that, I don't know if I'm really feeling Branch Rickey these days. I'm like, okay, but he's also the guy who did it. And so it was fun to really try to paint a truer picture of those times.
Yeah. So let's talk about Jackie Robinson in 1949. I guess it's his third year as a major leaguer. He's going to testify before the House Un-American Affairs Committee, which is known as HUAC.
Yes, Un-American Activities Committee. You had it right the first time.
Yeah, okay. It's Un-American Activities or Un-American Affairs?
Yes. Activities.
Okay, wow. So the Affairs Committee, that would have come later with, Marilyn Monroe and everything. Okay, so I know, bad.
What you did right there.
I'm surprised you don't leave now, Howard. So, but okay. So first of all, what was HUAC, and what brings Jackie Robinson in front of it?
Well, HUAC was a committee that had really focused on Japanese internment. It had begun in 1938 from Martin Dees from Texas. He was first called the Dees Committee. And but by the time we get to 1949, by the time we get through with World War II, it is now the goal of that committee is to hunt subversives, to hunt Americans who are disloyal. And so it has become a weapon, a prime weapon in the Cold War, given great subpoena powers by Congress. It really can do whatever it wants. And it has decided to go after the liberals. It's going after Hollywood. It's going after anybody who is sort of challenging this anti-communist crackdown. It goes after Robert Oppenheimer. It goes after so many prominent people of liberal politics. And what puts Jackie Robinson in front of it is Branch Rickey. Jackie had no interest in testifying. Jackie was not a political figure at that time. Branch Rickey felt that, number one, his monument, which they referred to me very condescendingly as the Great Experiment, which was baseball integration, was going to be threatened by the communist influence. And it is very true. The communist press really did push Ricky. Once again, that Brooklyn political climate was unique to the rest of the country. And I don't think Ricky wanted, he didn't want to share any credit with communists at all, that it was the Communist Daily Worker and Lester Rodney and Bill Mardo, a lot of those reporters who were really, really pushing baseball to integrate, wasn't going to share that, and also did not want, especially, once again, we're talking about how powerful those times were, didn't want baseball to be associated with any sort of communism whatsoever. So the best way to do that is to have Robinson speak in front of the committee. And the reason why Robinson is going to the committee is because earlier in 1949 and in April, Paul Robeson is in Paris at the Paris Peace Conference, which is a gathering of left-wing progressive politicals who are considered, the Paris Conference is considered communist propaganda, really run by the Soviet Union. Robeson gives a speech essentially that says, that we have no quarrel with the Soviet Union. Very, very similar to what Muhammad Ali would say 20 years later in Vietnam. I have no quarrel with the Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word, right? So it's a bit of a continuum. That quote comes back through the Associated Press as Robeson saying, it is unthinkable that any Negro would fight against the Soviet Union in case of a war. So of course, this really inflames everyone back home. And so now what do we have? We've got the confrontation. The best way to counter one of the most prominent Black voices is to have another prominent Black voice shout it down. And so that's how Jackie Robinson ends up in this arena against Paul Robeson. You've got the one most famous Black person in the country now being, speaking against the new most famous Black person in the country. And so these two guys had never met. And so it really is Branch Rickey who put them in this arena against each other. And one of the things, I'll be really quick on this, one of the things that I really, that really attracted me to this story is most times when we talk about Black history, we call it Black history. We just don't call it history. It's not history, and then there are Black people involved in it. It's Black history. So there's history here, and then we took our history goes over in the corner somewhere. And what I really liked about this project is the Cold War is not Black history. The Cold War is just plain old history. And this is a story of two American giants who were placed in the middle of history. And I thought it was really one of the first times that I saw a story that was an American story, the Cold War, a very specific story that was not centered on Black people, but had two Black people at the center of it for this little moment in history. And I think that sort of confrontation was really attractive and pretty fertile stuff to write about.
So, Rick, I was going to ask a question about Robinson's testimony, but I know you tried to have some footage there. Do you want to play that?
Yeah, we have a little. We have a little footage. I think I can make it go. Let's find.
Then I'll, if you can get that to work, then I'll
right. This is a little bit of footage we found online from Jackie Robinson's testimony, not about Paul Robeson, but speaking in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee.
I don't pretend to be an expert on communism or any other kind of politicalism, but you can put me down as being an expert on being a colored American with 30 years of experience at it. And just like any other colored person with any sense enough to look around him and understand what he sees. I know that life in these United States can be mighty tough for people who are a little different from the majority in their skin color or the way they worship their God or the way they spell their names.
So,
okay, Chris.
So what is Robinson saying about Robeson, and do you think it's coming from him, or is it somebody else coming through him?
Yeah, he doesn't want to be there. That's the first thing. He feels an obligation to be there along two lines. Number one, he feels obligated to Branch Rickey for many reasons. One, Branch Rickey is the one who integrated baseball. Hadn't been a Black player in the game since 1884. Rickey is the one who broke that line. And that was everything to Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson also viewed Branch Rickey, he would say, as a father figure. He also viewed the struggle as important. He felt it was important that as an African American, he speak up on behalf of Black people, because those hearings were essentially set up as a loyalty test for Black Americans. Were Black people actually loyal to America or to the Soviet Union? So he felt it was important to speak up on that, along those lines. So he felt that he had to say these things. However, when the speeches that were written for him by a combination of Lester Granger, who was with the Urban League, Branch Rickey's assistant, Arthur Mann, a lot of these drafts went back and forth. And a lot of the Robeson attacks, where he says, that I've got too much invested in my family to fall for a siren song sung in bass, which is an attack on the great bass baritone of Robeson. A lot of that stuff wasn't written by him. What was written by him, as you can go to the Library of Congress and read those different drafts, he's talking about a lot of the same things Robeson is talking about. He's talking about wealth inequality. He's talking about jobs. He's talking about police brutality. He's talking about fairness. These things didn't make the morning papers. But this, to me, was really important, because it was the essence, the true essence of Robinson. And the other thing about Robinson in his testimony as well is that he's not a happy man in 1949. We talk about 1947, when he integrates baseball, that this is the moment that baseball changes and that the world changes, because baseball has integrated. It's the first major institution in the country to really integrate. It integrates before Hollywood. It integrates before the military. It integrates before most schools. It integrates before corporate America. It integrates before the other sports. But he is signed in 1945. And by 1949, 4 years later, on opening day, there are only 7 Black players in the game. 5 of them play for the Dodgers and 2 of them play for the Cleveland Indians. So this idea that Robinson opened up the world to baseball and that baseball was receptive to that is 100% false. So the Jackie Robinson that is sitting in front of HUAC that day is frustrated by his own sport, that he's still pretty much by himself, and that the rest of the league is still very resistant. So what he is focusing on is the fact that, as he says, we don't need the communists to tell us all the problems that we have here. And yet he was really brought there to attack Robeson, and that was pretty much it. So what happened coming out of that testimony was he was there for one purpose, but he went there for his own purpose, and the two weren't the same.
Yeah. So what happens? You suggest that as we move into the 1950s and beyond, that Robinson's arc begins to parallel Robeson's arc, and I found that really fascinating. So, what makes you say that?
Well, the first thing is that Jackie Robinson didn't destroy Paul Robeson's career. Paul Robeson's career was heading in a downward spiral long before the testimony. But what happened to Robeson's career after Jackie's testimony was it really unleashed more violence against Robeson. Now that you had a Black man testifying against another Black man, now that you had the Black establishment essentially abandon Robeson as well, it was open season on Paul Robeson. So you have the Peekskill riot, you have 2 riots, within 6 weeks of Robinson's testimony. But here's what happens to Jackie. He becomes an American hero, more so than he had been before. The VFW and a lot of military groups, a lot of veterans groups really see him now as standing up for American values. But yet what is also happening here is he's finding out that there's not the change he was looking for. He's being lauded as this American hero, but yet most baseball teams still haven't integrated. His own industry hasn't integrated. By the time he retires after the 1956 season, there are 3 teams that still haven't had a Black player: the Tigers, the Phillies, and the Boston Red Sox. So he went through this entire journey, and still the change that he thought he was representing hadn't occurred. He goes full into the civil rights movement, and he's finding out that the allies that he thought he had, whether it was Eisenhower or Nixon or anyone else that he was supporting, that a lot of these, a lot of the political folks just saw race as a topic, as a politically expedient topic, and not something that needed to be dealt with. If it was good politics, yes. If it was bad politics, they ignored it, which is not very different than where Paul Robeson was in 1946 when he went to go meet with President Truman about the violence against returning Black soldiers. And Truman pretty much told him, hey, I understand, but it's really bad politics right now. It's not a great time to deal with this. And so you can see these two men who were placed in opposition to each other. They are fighting they're fighting the same fight, and they are beginning to meet a similar disillusionment. The other thing that Robinson's testimony did to Robeson was it emboldened the federal government. And the very next year in 1950, the government did not renew Robeson's passport and essentially had him under house arrest for nearly a decade.
So, as all this is happening, you spend a good portion of the beginning of the book talking about what a giant Robeson is. He crosses this Rubicon. He gives this speech in Paris. He's now kind of enemy number one. You would think that more people would be saying, hey, wait a minute. But they don't. But particularly I was struck by the fact that, the NAACP and these leading African-American organizations seem to be kind of sitting back and watching Robeson just be taken apart piece by piece. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Chris, I think you're being kind. They were not sitting back and watching him being taken apart. They were actively contributing to his being taken apart.
Okay.
And part of the reason was because it was communism. That was the first thing, that they considered Robeson a tool of Joseph Stalin. They considered him an associate. Okay, well, all of the things that we're talking about with this Red Scare, he's one of them. They viewed him as a communist, and he didn't disavow that. He never said he was a member of the party, but certainly as the term went back then, he was a fellow traveler. He was absolutely a socialist. He was absolutely anti-communist. Anti-capitalism in terms of anti-capitalist in terms of, not believing that the American system was fair. He was a Wallace man. He was a Henry Wallace progressive who believed in universal health care and all of these things. And these were toxic ideas. And the NAACP's position was, we're trying to get somewhere, man. We are trying to work with these allies because our numbers aren't big enough. We need political allies, and you are not helping. Mm-hmm. Communism it's a non-starter. You are not, and they were very, both, especially the NAACP was extremely angry with Robeson. They loved that he fundraised for them. They loved when he raised money for them, but they didn't feel that he was being very helpful to the cause. That if we associate with you and you will not disassociate with the Soviet Union, then all of the allies that we have are going to abandon us. You're going to kill the movement. And so they made it very, very clear. And also, let's not forget, they were being pressured by the State Department and J. Edgar Hoover and everyone else to say, hey, you need to fall in line as well. And the easiest way for them to fall in line was to sacrifice Robeson.
Yeah. So there's so many ways that we can go here, but look, both of these guys, after they died, were very heavily praised. And I mean, it's kind of a harsh question, but did it become easier for white America to praise and honor these men after they died, when they were no longer sort of inconveniently there with their difficult opinions?
Well, very much so. And I think it was much easier for everybody, considering that once you're no longer a threat, now we can reappraise you in a much softer light. We can look at you. Maybe it wasn't so bad after all, when it was really, really, really bad. And I think that was one of the appeals of the book. And that was one of the things that I really wanted to sort of focus on as well, was how did these two men end up where they were, and how do they end up in similar places? But also what I really loved to focus on too was how the people who did support them never really abandoned them either. That there was that what they stood for has endured. And it's less so with Robeson simply because because of the activity, the act of nature that it took to sort of erase him or try to erase him from history. But all the things that he talked about in the 1930s about the 99% and the 1%, it's all the language that we're still using today. And I do feel like in Jackie's case, his reputation was never really survived the Robeson piece of it, or the fact that he had supported Richard Nixon in 1960. He still gets criticized for that to this day, even though he's been dead since 1972. But I do love the fact that his wife, Rachel, who's still alive, 103, she'll be 104 in July, that, you know, she said, we got two bad pieces of advice. One was the support of Nixon in 1960, and the other was testifying against Paul Robeson. And that was, you know, one of them, of course, was Branch Rickey. But I also feel like one of the things that we also need to do, like one of the things you can't do if you're going to try to write well, you can't take a 2026 approach to something that happened in the 1940s. And you have to be able to try to immerse yourself in that time. And Jackie Robinson was one of the, he was born in 1919. And so in 1932, a Gallup poll asked, you know, what parties that did African Americans identify most with. It was 50-50 Republican Democrat. So this whole idea that, oh, Jackie Robinson was a sellout and he was a Republican, and it wasn't like that at that time. Robinson was a guy who believed that, look, we are 10% of the population at that time. We're 10% of the population. We have to have a voice in both parties. If we don't have a voice in both parties, we're going to be at the mercy of one of them, you know, or both of them, actually. And so I really did appreciate that, yes, by the time he did pass away in 72, only 53 years old, even some of his great detractors did recognize that this guy did everything he could for his people.
Can I jump in with a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
You know, I was just curious, Howard. You mentioned Rachel Robinson, who's still alive, 52 years after her husband, 54 years after her husband passed away.
He's been a widow longer than Jackie was alive. Yeah.
So did you, I mean, I'm sure you've talked to her over the years. Did you talk to her about this book? Did you try to get her opinion? And I'm just curious what happened there.
Well, she's 103, not really doing interviews, not really, you know, and when I spoke to her years ago just about a little bit of this, she didn't really try, it didn't make sense to do interviews with her because she said she did not trust her own recollections, her own memory. So, and I understood that. I think when you're 100 years old, you've sort of earned the right to say yes and no to things.
or 60.
Hoping to get there.
Right.
So now this is a total divergence, and I apologize for that. But there's so much in this book that I just was fascinating and struck me just completely from left field. There is a person in this book that, again, we should know an awful lot more about, who I had never heard of, and that's Moses Fleetwood Walker. Right?
I thought you were going to say Ruth Shipley, who was my favorite.
That was another question, but there's this person that you describe, and he writes this book, Our Home Colony. And I thought, why have we never heard it? So who is Moses Fleetwood Walker? What's this book you wrote, and why is he sort of inserted into your story?
Well, because this idea, the Du Bois idea of two-ness, and if you're born of a certain generation, if you're born in the right century or over the right course of a century, you cover a lot of ground. That was one of the things that I found so amazing about doing this project. Du Bois was born in 1868. He dies the day before the March on Washington in 1963. He's 95 years old. So he covers Robert E. Lee. He covers Frederick Douglass. He covers Harriet Tubman. He covers Muhammad Ali, Jackie Robinson. This is just one lifetime. And Fleet Walker was the first Black player in the major leagues back in 1884. And after the 1884 season, he and all the other, you know, the handful of Black players are essentially, you know, ejected from the major leagues. They are, you know, they're essentially let go. You know, they're not allowed to play anymore. And so Fleet Walker is lost to history. And so now when we think about the first Black player in baseball history, we think about Jackie Robinson. And so Walker was a man who lost everything during that time. As we get into the, you know, repealing of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and now we're ushering in Jim Crow, and it's all going to be different until we get to Rosa Parks and we get to MLK and that. So in those 20 years after being expelled from Major League Baseball, Moses Fleetwood Walker writes a book called Our Home Colony, which is essentially his memoir of his own life. And his conclusion is that there is no reconciliation here, that there's no hope here, that the real hope for the Black American is to leave America. It's to not be here at all. And it was fascinating to me because I'd never seen this book before, published in 1906. And Fleetwood Walker, it made for an interesting bookend to me, that we know the Jackie Robinson story, but we had never heard of Moses Fleetwood Walker, and that Walker's conclusion was that to be of a Garveyite. It was essentially to say that that there is no hope for Black people to make it, that repatriation is actually the solution.
Yeah. So you've written a book about America and about history, not just Black history. But how do you feel this story and the issues that it raises are relevant today? Because clearly some of this stuff you've written about as happening in the past, but some of these things are kind of still going on. So what's your take on how this relates to today?
One of my favorite things about doing the book was how much every other paragraph told me this feels like now, this feels like now, this feels like now. And so it was really enjoyable to feel like you were writing history that didn't feel dusty. It was very much present. When you look at the forces in the country right now and where we are in terms of, our current politics, when you look at the discussion, the language of the Cold War, how all of that language is still sort of very much in us today. I was thinking about this earlier about the athletes such as Jackie Robinson and other Muhammad Ali and some of these other athletes traveling the world on behalf of the State Department, whether it's the Olympics or whether it's sort of these individual tours. All this is happening at the same time that Black rights are being eroded at home. And that all felt very, very similar. The attack on universities feels very, very similar to where we are today. The attack on free speech, all of it felt very, very present. And that was really enjoyable, because when you're working on these projects, you are wondering, okay, how much does the public know? And how much backstory do I have to do? How relevant does any of this feel? And working on this project, it felt very much like it could be written in the current first person today.
Yeah. So do we have time, Rick? Or
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So,
wrap it up for us.
The story of Jackie Robinson, in a lot of ways, it's almost become sort of American folklore, right? And so, with the popular history version of it. As you were researching this book and you were kind of dealing with these two men and the legacy of this, is there anything that surprised you in the course of the research, things that you didn't expect to find, or things that, stood out that you think should be kind of folded into the mix, I guess?
Well, I think the most important, the thing that surprised me the most was that they'd never met. That was crazy, that you have two guys of that level of fame, both of them in Harlem, and their paths had never crossed. I thought that was fascinating. I thought the other piece of it that I really enjoyed sort of working on was the totality in which you could erase a person, someone of that level, that once, the speed in which the wave goes along, that people just are disappeared. And it wasn't just Robeson. Look at them all. Look at Canada Lee. Look at Lena Horne. Look at John Garfield or Edward G. Robinson. So many famous people. Look at Oppenheimer, who lost his security clearance. I mean, that was the piece to me, was how quickly it was easily forgotten what we have done to our own citizens.
Well, yeah, and it was fascinating that Paul Robeson was even removed from like the Rutgers, athletic guides. I mean, he really was. The people went in and just erased
literally
game
erased, exactly like the football teams at Rutgers when he was on the All-American teams. Instead of having 11-man teams, because there's 11 players on the field now, there are 10 players on the team. They just erased him out of the record book.
Yeah,
The level of vindictiveness and
yeah.
I that's what really struck me. I mean, they canceled him, but then they made sure he was, triply canceled, which I just found.
Well, and it was interesting because this is the 50th anniversary of his death in 1976. And it really does tell you how much, how quickly things change, how quickly we can forget things if you allow them to be forgotten. And how active you have to be to do that. It's not an accident. It's very much deliberate.
Yeah.
Howard Durant, thank you so much for joining us today to chat about.
My pleasure. Thank you. This one went by really, really fast. I feel like I didn't even say anything.
No,
you go back and watch it. You said a lot, but we want to just mention your book because it's definitely worth reading. Kings and Pawns, Jackie Robinson and Paul Robeson in America. And we have hit a lot of it, but man, there's a lot in there that
absolutely
to make you think and consider what's going on. So Howard, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's my pleasure.
Take care.
Okay, so next week, Chris, we are going to be chatting with Cheryl Thompson, and she is the author of a book. I just started it today called Tuskegee Airmen. Actually, the book is called The Search for the Lost
Tuskegee Airmen.
Yeah, the book is actually called, come on, Rick, get this straight. The book is actually called Forgotten Souls.
The big print at the bottom.
I don't even know what part of the screen I should be reading. Forgotten Souls, The Search for the Lost Tuskegee Airmen. Cheryl, if you're watching, I'm sorry. But it's about her search. Her father was a Tuskegee Airman, and she kind of went on this search to find out what she could about the 27 Tuskegee Airmen who essentially disappeared, right? Missing in action, believed killed. I mean, certainly killed, but nobody knew what happened to them. So she's dug into that, and we look forward to talking to her about that next week.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for joining us. We do appreciate it. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, become a patron at patreon.com, listen to our podcast, and of course, browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.